Okay, we're going to get started with the next session. This is the one that you've all been waiting for, the fun operational budget form. So as some of you that have been in this process a while may remember, we used to require this form on your original budget submission when you gave us your budget issues, and we had different columns, and we said, okay, here's your actuals right now, here's what you're requesting in these columns. And then again, at the end, when we finally had an approved budget, we'd ask you to submit the form to us again. And so that was taking out all the requested. You may have still had to adjust what your currents are. And so we've changed that process as the budget committee has worked through. We've gotten to the point where we're developing a base budget, which the word base does not mean that's the minimum amount you can operate with. It just means this is our starting point. So we have that starting point in our base budget. Then we ask for you to submit your budget issues. We ask that you submitted issues to get your grand total to the amount that you were requesting. And we had said, this isn't the pie in the sky, but it's also not the bare bones. This is in order to accomplish my statutory required duties, here is what I'm asking for. And so after the budget committee goes through their process, evaluating those decisions for this past fiscal year, we landed on, we want to make sure we're covering the FRS increases. We want to make sure we're covering health insurance increases. They got to a number. And then once we get that revenue amount from EDR, then we prorate that down and then land on your final approved budget for the fiscal year. And now that we have that number, the CCOC is asking that you complete this operational budget to tell us where exactly that number is. What is personnel? What is operating? What other funding sources are you going to have? And so I feel like every year we get better and better at this process. When I was first hired almost 5 years ago now, this was a brand new concept. We completely reworked the form from what it was. The prior form didn't have a whole lot of automatic checks in it. It didn't, you had to do extra calculations and gyrations to make each tab tie to the next. And so the way that this form is laid out, you start with the beginning tabs, and as you work through, information is carried forward. And so you can see pretty quickly when you don't tie, when things are out of line, warnings pop up, and then you can go back and address it. So on the first tab is the warnings, and we have 4 levels. A green level warning is our level 4. It's the top warning, and that is just informational. That's just a, hey, FYI, you've got something and you need to look at and just, verify if it's correct or not. And so in the column D, you can say, yes, I have verified that that is correct. And then that's it. That's not going to affect your form from being able to come into our database. Everything is that's just a heads up warning. A level 3 warning is a yellow warning. And that one is saying, hey, we've noticed something. It might still be fine, but we want you to take a look at it. It's a little bit more than just a notification warning. And then the level 2 warning is an orange warning. Those are, okay, we're seeing something that we want to make sure is verified and validated because we're looking for information and we're not seeing it. That's that type of warning. You can still submit a budget with those warnings, but we're going to be looking for an explanation on D, or we're going to be looking for explanation on the tab that it applies to. And that may be something that we may, have to call you and talk to you about, or, get some information on. So anything that you can provide on the front end is helpful. That way we're not having the back and forth and getting new versions. But then the highest warning, a level 1 red error, that's telling you that you have a critical error. You've got something that we're not going to be able to bring this in with that kind of warning on there. We're not going to be able to do our comparisons to each other. There's a critical issue that we need fixed. And so when you first start, you're going to have these warnings pop up. Don't worry about that. Just ignore that for the minute. You're going to want to go to your county name and pick your county name because information is populated in this form based on your county. So you'll see that when we get to the tabs on the end where that information comes into play. So the main thing to remember on the front page is to check for these warnings. Come back at the end. Don't worry about them at the beginning, but at the end, come back and look at them and then see where you need to fix information. The warnings will tell you specifically in column A what exhibit they're related to. So you'll see this one's related to exhibit B, which is the tab down here. This is B1, gross FTEs. So you'll know exactly where to go look to handle those. But you don't want to worry about them at the beginning. You want to wait till you're at the end. And you'll see you may have some warnings that you can't read all of it. And you should just be able to grab that cell and open it up so that you can read it. And then if you find yourself working through the process and you get stuck, please do not spend more than 15 or 20 minutes trying to figure it out. Call our office, call me, Griffin, get on the phone with us because we can help you probably pretty quick. I did one year, several years ago, had a county that said, I have been looking at this for 4 hours and I just can't make it work. I don't know what's wrong. And she sent it to me and I said, well, you didn't put your county name first. And the minute she put her county name, it fixed everything. So please do not waste 4 hours of your day trying to figure it out. If you get 15, 20 minutes max, if you can't figure out what you need to do in 15, 20 minutes, you just call us and we'll get you straightened away. Or if you say, hey, I think I'm done. Can you just look at this really quick before I submit it to reports? That's great. Send it to me, send it to Griffin. We'll take a look at it and make sure that we don't see any, big things that we need fixed. But do not copy us when you're submitting your final report. When you send it to reports, just send it to reports. Do not copy us because we all have access to that. And so if you send it to me and Griffin and reports, then 3 copies of that is going on our server. And then our email server just starts blowing up with all these extra files that we don't need. So just send it to reports and we'll be good. But if at any time you've got any questions, just reach out. Okay, Exhibit B is the Gross Core Personnel Detail tab. And this tab is the heart of the entire report. This tab builds everything forward. Usually if you have issues later on, it comes back to this tab. This is your live and die by this tab. It's a lot of information. It's a lot of detail. We have a lot of automatic checks that we have built in. There's some pre-populated fields for you. You can override those, but this is the one that's going to take you the most time. And if you have issues, typically we're going to see them here. So for the first column, it's the position number. You can enter your position number. It used to only be numerical, and then some counties said, well, I want it to match my system. I want it to tie to my report, and I use alphanumeric, and so we've worked with it. But honestly, you can just do your positions as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we just need a way of keeping each position line unique when we bring it into our database. The first line is for the elected clerk, and you'll see that that's been hard-coded for you. We did that because we did have several years where people forgot to enter their clerk's information. They entered all their staff and not their elected clerk. So we hard-coded that so that we know when we're looking at these spreadsheets, every single county, line 5 is going to be the elected clerk. And that helps us when we're doing our data extract to be able to get the information consistently. You're going to enter the employment type. And so we have several employment types. We have a benefit eligible position, OPS part-time, not benefit eligible, OPS part-time, benefit eligible, contract FTE, no position anticipated, and volunteer. When we first created these forms, we had counties that utilized the last 2 in an effort to deal with budget cuts. And so some counties, they had court-related duties and functions being handled by volunteers, or they had a contract position where they outsourced it, but they didn't anticipate that that position would be filled. So it's not like if I got the budget, I was going to fill it with a full-time position. It was work that they could contract out, but they paid for it out of their personnel budget. And so that's why it's reflected on this tab. If you have contract work that you pay for out of your operational budget, that's on the operation tab. So that's the key distinction between those types. And that's something that I've actually looked at. We don't have counties that are using that information in that detail quite as much anymore as they did in the first years when we developed this form. So this next fiscal year, I think, is something that maybe the budget committee can put a small work group of staffers together and say, okay, we're looking at the actual data that's been submitted the last 3 fiscal years. We're looking at our form. What can we take out? What's no longer valid? What's no longer needed? And try and streamline anywhere that we can, because this is a lot of detailed information. The CCOC is working on looking at getting our database back online. As some of you remember, we had a system called Tabs that we used, that you could upload your EC report, that you could upload your budget information, and then you in your office had access to all of the statewide information. You could look at your peer group, you could look at the entire state, you could just look at one county. You had that information at your fingertips. So we're wanting to get back to that point. So I'm hoping we might not have to deal with this big, huge, convoluted form for much longer, and that we'll get to a system that will be easier to use. But until then, this is what we have. And so I want to try and keep looking at it and making sure that we're making it work for you in your offices. So if you have a situation that's not covered in the budget instructions, please let us know, call us so we can figure it out, because you might not be the only county that has that situation. But if you don't let us know, we can't make the adjustments to the forms to meet your needs. So I want to make sure that we're being responsive to the needs of our counties. So then column D is the FRS type. And when this type is selected, that's how the calculation is done further on in column L for the FRS amount. And you'll see that. You have a column to indicate whether a position is vacant. If it is vacant, the length of vacancy, and then the pay type. You have lots of options to pick from there. Again, annual versus hourly versus contract. If a position is marked as annual in column H, we're going to look for an annual pay type. If your position in G is marked as hourly in column H, we're looking for the hourly pay type. But then in column J, regardless of whether H is hourly or annual, we're looking for the annual amount. So that's one of the areas that we see a lot of audit findings on, is getting the consistency between setting the pay type as an annual pay type, and I've entered an annual amount in H, and then I also enter annual amount in J. Or it's an hourly pay type. I've entered an hourly amount. Let me just make them make something. And then I've entered their hours and then how much that they make. So just making sure that that's consistent. And then entering your FICA amount. And you'll notice some of these that turn peach, it's because information has been entered, so we expect to see the rest of this filled out. So if you put a position number in, the peach cells are going to say, okay, now you need personnel data to match. And so you'll see that as you type information, that those cells turn back to green. If for some reason you've got a cell that won't go away, call me, because we have found out that something as small as a space that you can't really see when you're looking at it is what's causing the error. So again, don't spend too much time trying to figure out why it won't go away or why it's still peach. Just call me and we will calculate it and figure it out. And so you'll see that because I entered that FRS type in the previous column, I have an FRS calculation done for me in column L. And then your health insurance columns, it's M or N. You can either fill out your general health amount or your budgeted month amount. So when looking at these, we're looking at positions and their position types. So you don't necessarily have to get down to the level of each person in that position. If you want to budget at the higher, just, it doesn't matter who's in this position. Should that person leave? Should someone new come in? Here is the amount that I'm budgeting for it. You know, budgeting is not actuals. It is your higher overarching level of how you anticipate this year to go. As you have personnel changes, we do not track that during the year. You don't have to send in a revised operational budget every time you have a personnel action, or if you decide, okay, we don't need as much in that operating category. We're going to move it to this operating category. We don't collect that data. We just collect it on the front end. So this is just your best guess as to how you think you're going to divvy out the dollars that you were appropriated from the budget committee. So you can choose with your health insurance to do a general amount or by position if you have an amount. Some counties, they have their health insurance is a flat rate per employee, regardless of whether they're a management or they're an entry-level clerk. They have one flat amount. Others, it's based on the different type of coverage you have, whether you have a family plan, whether you're single or whatever. So you have that flexibility and that available to you. And then any amounts that you have for life insurance under column P for other benefits, dental, vision, or supplemental coverage. If you enter an amount for column P, we're going to be looking for an explanation in the text box below. And so over here, and I'm going to zoom this in so you get a good look at it. There's this row visible tool. And if you check that, uncheck blanks and say, okay, it hides all of the rows without any data. So your form is much more manageable. We had to make sure that our forms had enough rows for our big counties as well as our little. So that was a tool that we created so you can get rid of all those blanks and get to where you need to be. So again, if you have an amount here in this column, column P, then a warning is going to pop up on the front screen, and we're going to be looking for this text box right here. We're going to be looking for an explanation in that text box. And then finishing off that first line, in Q is for any budgeted separation payout. It really saddens my heart every time I see dollars in this column because I know we're losing some phenomenal staff. And this past year, we had several retirements. And so if you know at the beginning of the year that you're going to have individuals retiring through the year, you know you're going to have a payout. Any of that information would go in this column. And then, of course, you have your court, non-court allocation. And so calculating this percentage and this amount per employee, that is going to be in the afternoon session. And that's going to come into play for this column as well as the next tab that we're going to talk about. And so in the budget instructions, I've got screenshots and I've got detailed, okay, if you have a position that is this, that, the other, here's how you're going to enter them. If you have this, then they get this. If it's that, they get that. So go through those if you haven't already, if you're brand new to the process. And if you have questions, let us know. But for those that have been doing this a while, I think most of you have got it down pat now. And we're trying to not change this a lot year to year so that we can get consistent data that we can make comparisons to. One of the areas is like overtime, workers' comp, unemployment. We have some counties that are like, well, we don't pay for that. The county does. Well, that's great. That's wonderful. But if it's a court-related cost, we still need to see it. We want to see that on the front end and have it backed out on the summary tab, which we'll get to at the end. Any costs that touch your court side, we want to see them on this spreadsheet. And then if you have a funding source outside of your court budget because your court budget is insufficient, then we have a tab for that. We have rows for that so that we can see that information. We want to start getting to, again, every year getting better and better with our data, getting better and better with our accuracy, because those numbers are used in our offices. We use it when we're doing bill analyses. We use it when we're talking with the legislature and we're, lobbying on your behalf with the state as the budgeting arm of the two sides of this coin. We have FCCC on one side and CCOC on the other. We're working in tandem, and having the data really helps. It's not just an anecdotal story. It's not a heartbreaking story. It's not a feel-good story. It's the numbers, and the numbers are backing up, what we're presenting. So if you have positions that are 100% non-court, they do not go on this form. If you have positions that you use for that are funded with the pandemic recovery funds, they're not going to go on this form. So anything related to the pandemic recovery, we have that as a separate amount because while we are asking for it in year 2, and we'll hopefully get, that's no guarantee. So because we have a separate funding source for that, it does not the same funding source as the rest of our budget. We're tracking that separately. So we don't want that on this form because we have the information that we can track and report and do in its own little silo. So I did have that question this week that I wanted to make sure I made clear. So anything that's court related will be on this tab. And then everything's totaled here at the bottom. And then, like I said, this information is going to carry forward to our subsequent tabs. Yeah. Raphael, this question. So should we budget? Yes. Any other questions related to personnel? Okay, and I will point out to you at the end of the day, we do have a session where CCOC staff will be here available if after, going to lunch after we get done, you have some questions, things pop up. Maybe it's a question related to something completely else that we didn't cover. We're just going to have staff here available to answer those questions. So if you think of something later, by all means, catch one of us or, send us an email. We'll be happy to walk through it with you. So the next part of the personnel section is B1, gross FTEs. This is also probably the trickiest part of this form because you're getting down to breaking out your FTEs by court division. And I know some of you, you don't have your offices set up that way, but this is a way that we have been using because the state requires that you use the UAS codes. And so whenever you have a DFS audit, they're going to be looking at those UAS codes. They're going to be looking at your files and saying, okay, well, you said on your budget that it's going to be XYZ, and then your actuals ended up being this. What's the variance? We've not seen any audit findings for differences, for deltas, but we have seen audit findings for not using the UAS codes or not using them appropriately. The first column, column A, is for your cost centers. You can use those as how your office is laid out. You can use the court divisions. We've seen lots of counties do that just to keep it all tied and together. Or one area that we were hoping that we could get to is using the clerk's, oh goodness, Jason. Yes, thank you. The court services framework. Gotta work on that name, as areas, because the clerk court services framework has your statutory references for all of your duties. So if you're statutorily required to perform these functions, then you can tie that to your budget. That is like the holy grail for us data wonks. We love being able to say, okay, legislature, you're now adding XYZ in these areas, and we can prove to you based on our numbers that statewide, that cost us about XYZ. So for this bill, here is now our fiscal impact. So if you can get to that level, that is like the ultimate for us. And if you need some help with that, we've had, I know Clay County, when Tara first came on board, she used it just to see, am I doing all the duties I'm supposed to be doing? And then if I'm doing duties that I'm not required to do, why am I doing them? And so it's a management tool, but it can also be a budgeting tool. And so that's kind of where I would love to see us get to, where we can have things that tie. I remember when I was working in the governor's office, that was like the one word that would just make you lock up, is you've done all this work and you've done all this presentation and you're getting everything ready. And then the final question from your budget chief is, what are your numbers, Ty? Let me go check. So having things consistent and having things tie, those are the things that make my little organizer heart happy. So what we don't want to see in these cost centers is we do not want to see employee names. We have some counties that are very small. but we don't want to tie it directly to individual employees. That's not what we want. And we do have this data get, like I said, when DFS does their audits, they ask us for your budget files. They ask us for your final EC report. They ask us for your final outputs report and your final collections report. And then those are the reports that they use when they're looking at your actuals to see, do you have the supporting documentation to match what you submitted to CCOC? We have a few of the cost centers that are pre-populated up above, and that's because we want to make sure that we identified those areas. Again, this is probably another area that we can look at and say, you know, are there different ways of collecting this data or organizing it? But anytime you enter a cost center, that cost center, let me zoom this in so you can see it a little better. It's brought forward, if you'll see that in column A, and on the C tabs and D tabs as well. So that gets carried forward the whole way. So you're going to want to make sure that you take the time and effort to get the personnel tabs divided out like you're going to need for the future. We do not want cost centers that do not have FTE or do not have personnel costs or do not have operating costs. So for us, that just throws a kink in our database. So we only want to see the cost centers that are going to have associated FTEs or associated personnel. Personnel or operating. If you have a cost center that might not have FTE or personnel costs, but does have operating costs, that's fine. There is a warning that will pop up on the front screen, and you can just explain to us why that cost center is an operating only cost center. Or the flip side, if that is an FTE and personnel only cost center, but no operating, just to provide us explanation for why that would be the case. But if you have FTEs on this tab, then when we get to the B2 tab, we're going to be looking for the dollars to go with it, because you told us that there was FTEs. So if there's a person associated, there's a person's cost associated too. So that's another one of the audit findings, or not audit findings, technical review. When we do our technical review, that was one of our things that we noticed. And then you'll notice that, again, the same Make the Rows Visible tool is available, so you can take out all the extra lines that you're not using to keep it clean and easier for you to look at. And then the other thing to point out on the B1 tab is on row 4, we have these different breakouts. And these breakouts are tied to your jury. So if you have an FTE that you have indicated is part of your jury, then it's going to take these percentages and break out that FTE across those divisions. So column E is the circuit criminal with jury management breakout. Column G is the circuit civil with jury management breakout. And so you can see of that one FTE, it's putting 0.77 into the circuit criminal and 0.23 into the circuit civil. And you can adjust those percentages as you need to get your FTEs to line up where you want. Any questions? You'll probably have 10 tomorrow, but you just call me and it'll be okay. And so then on the personnel cost tab, this amount in B12 comes from your B tab, your total dollars there. And so any dollar amount that's there, we're expecting to see it allocated across so that it goes to 0. We have some counties that, you know, they don't have a whole lot of cost centers or a whole lot of staff, and they want to leave it on line 12. But if you leave it on line 12, it's an automatic calculation based on where your FTEs are located. And that might not necessarily be accurate or true if you have some other costs that's that you need to include. So if you, on your personnel tab, if you have any amounts that you enter on these lower levels, these are going to come in at 100% court costs. But anything that you enter on an individual personnel level, your costs are going to be divided based on whatever allocation that you used. Oops. Whatever allocations that you used in your percentages there. But anything down below, those are going to be 100% court. So you might have to adjust your dollars on your personnel B2 tab based on that information. And anything for the elected clerk, we're going to look and make sure that it is equal to or greater than your clerk costs. And then the rest of it is going to be just allocated as you indicate to us. One thing to note with the jury costs, and as you'll see, the Title 4D, those are in gray. On our summary tab at the end, it's a little bit confusing. It's not just a straight linear. There is a plus minus plus situation that we have, and I'll get into detail on that. But those informations for those individual lines are going to come from these tabs and these cells specifically. So if you have Title 4D and you know that you're getting your funding for it, but you have costs over your funding, then that's how you divide out between whether it's a reimbursed or non-reimbursed. So the reimbursed should match the amount that you're getting from Title 4D, and then the non-reimbursed is any of your costs above that reimbursement. And then same with jury. You have been given an approximation for jury, so you're going to give us the amount that you have for jury, and that will be the amount that ties to your jury budget authority. And so you'll see on the future tab, if you have costs over that amount that you already know you're going to have, it's going to do an automatic calculation and pop up some fancy work that says, okay, well, your budget authority was only this amount and you've indicated costs above it. Therefore, that delta now needs to come from your CCOC side, and we're going to make sure that's accounted for when we get to the end, when we're tying to our total budget. Any questions about those personnel tabs? Okay, moving on to the operational. This one's a little bit easier and straightforward. You have your UAS codes in column A. And this is another area that I want to look at. You know, I feel like there's a lot of these that we never use, but I'm sure there's cost there. Or maybe that there will never be cost there and we should probably just take it out because it's just taking up space. But any cost that you have for operating for your court related needs to be entered on the C exhibit. If you enter anything in one of those that have an other, then this warning is going to pop up that says explain in additional info. We have a warning on the front tab that pops up, but a lot of times it got overlooked, or they would provide explanation on the front tab and not the tab related to the warning. So now that this will pop up, that will help give you a reminder that you need to tell us what those costs are there. And then also included in the operating detail is your amounts for jury. And that you would enter, and then that amount is going to be carried forward for your jury costs. Any questions on operating? Okay, and then the same thing, the total dollar amounts that are entered on the C tab gets brought forward to C1. So the prior tab is the detail, and now at the rolled up level, you're going to tell us how much your costs are. So like for jury, we said that it was $14.50. When I look over here, I'm going to expect to see $14.50 for jury. The other way that is handled is if, say I break out my jury across my cost centers, then this whole total for column E, I'm looking to make sure does not exceed the amount that I entered for jury on the C tab. So you can do it that way if that's easier for how you do your allocations, or if it's just easier to lump jury, and the intersection of where the two meet, the court division jury and the cost center jury. So whether you put the whole amount there, or if you divide it out, just make sure that column E does not exceed the amount that you indicated for jury. And with this tab, you'll notice that these cells across the court divisions are yellow. That means that with an operating cost, you can redistribute it across the court centers. However, if you do that, the automatic formulas in some scenarios go away. So we have an automatic where column R, civil traffic, if any adjustments need to be made based on what you've entered and how you've entered it, column R in civil traffic is our balancing line. And so that's why that one is grayed out. So if you're not careful, you'll get a negative number in column R, and then that throws off our data, because when it comes into the final spreadsheet, the final summary tab at the end of the spreadsheet, it starts reducing to make the total. So your total lines will match, but then when we look at it in our office and say, okay, well, I just want to know about civil traffic and I'm going to apply it to this, that, and the other, it starts doing a statewide negative then. And so we don't want negative numbers in our allocations. So just be sure that if you make any manual changes to this tab, that your sum totals of your column are still where they need to be, and that you don't have any negative numbers. And then if you do have a negative number, one of the easiest ways to fix it is finding the court division that you've applied your FTE to, because that's what the formula wants to do. It's saying, hey, you've got FTE in probate, so I'm trying to put dollars in probate. Being able to reduce one column that has dollars by $1 and then adding it to the column that's negative, because what we saw was it was always negative by $1. So taking from a division that had that dollar and then adding it to the one that went negative was able to help us. So, and that was just because there was some manual calculations that overrode the automatics. Okay. Any questions about reporting operating? Okay, and then on capital, we don't tend to have too much capital, just because if you look at the budget instructions, we outline the different functions that you are allowed to allocate CCOC funding to. And then there are specific functions that you are not allowed to apply CCOC funding to. And if you'll look in the exhibit, in Exhibit E is our DFS audit findings from the prior year. And so one of the audit findings that we have seen consistently is the inappropriate use of CCOC dollars. And so one of the major things is funding that's a county's responsibility. So funding for building repairs, phone lines, different things like that. There are certain technology functions from the Records Modernization Trust Fund that can be funded from the CCOC funds that do not exceed the 10%. So I included that as a note on this item, so that would help bring it to your attention that yes, there's still some IT stuff that you can do. And so if you include them, we're looking for that IT information on the summary tab at the end. And then again, if you include any capital costs here, we're going to be looking for an explanation, and then we're going to look for that to tie to the information you provide here by the court divisions and cost centers. Any questions on that? Okay, and then nearly there, this is the third most important tab, is the net budget amounts. And all of the information in columns B through K are brought from the information that's that we had on the detail tabs. You'll notice that I have like a negative 0.02 because I didn't have enough FTE entered on my B tab before entering information going forward. So automatically I can see immediately it's gone red. I need to fix that, but that's where that information comes from. And so over here is where we take the FTEs, we get a total gross FTE, then we back out the Title 4D, we back out the jury because we have a separate funding source for that. And then if you have any other non-CCOC funding, if you have very specific, like FDLE is going to pay for 1 FTE so that we can do a backlog of XYZ. You got a grant for that. That would go on line 19 and that would be backed out. And then that gives us our subtotal for the FTEs, not including IT. So that's our plus, our minus, and now plus again, we add back the IT FTE. And then on line 26, we have a actual percent allocation. And then line 27 is an targeted. And target might be probably the wrong term to use, but it is based on the numbers that we have seen statewide. This is about the average that we have seen. And we haven't updated that number in several years. We actually looked at it, not the current budget year's budget development cycle, but the prior one, and found that as people were doing a better job of entering what their true situation was, those numbers still haven't changed. They didn't change enough that we needed to change this allocation. I know when the allocation first was presented, Doug Isabel had told me that counties were instructed to make their numbers match the target allocations, to make them be consistent statewide. And now we're getting away from forcing you into a scenario that doesn't work for you. And we're now getting to where we want to know what your actuals are. We want to know what nuances there are to know about your counties, what things are going to cause those changes, because we can recognize then with that information, okay, so under this scenario, this is what happens to our numbers. And we can start using that information in, again, our messaging to the governor, the legislature. We can start using that to explain, okay, there is an anomaly. Here's what that anomaly costs you. And so now, budget committee, you can decide how you want to address those anomalies. You can decide whether you want to develop a policy for those anomalies, whether you want to, identify these are the parameters of anomalies that we see. So that just provides us more information that don't think that you have to make your numbers forced to meet those target allocations. However, you'll notice that the numbers will change color. And so if there will be a warning on the front tab, if it's, I think it's greater than 10%, then we'll ask you to provide an explanation for why your anomaly exists. But it's not an error or a warning that won't allow your budget to come in. We'll still be able to process it, but that's just one of those areas where we'll have questions and we'll want some follow-up. Okay, and then the second section is the expenses piece. And so again, it's our pluses of everything prior that comes forward. And then our minus, where we back out Title 4D, back out jury, back out any county funding that ties to those FTEs we had in the prior section, or any non-CCOC funding that we have. And then again, if you have anything in these rows, then we're going to be looking for explanation. And in this case, the explanation box is not on this tab, but it's on the next tab on tab G. So we're going to be looking to make sure that if you have entered anything as a non-CCOC funding source, that you have provided us explanation as to what that source is and what it's for. And then after the pluses and the minus, then we add back the IT that you're requesting to be funded from the CCOC Trust Fund. And again, we're going to be, as you go through the year, you're going to need to make sure that any amount that you are estimating for that does not exceed your collected 10%. And that's tracked on your EC report. Okay, and then at the bottom is where we take your approved budget authority and we take the amounts that you have entered and make sure that they tie. And you'll see we have some automatic calculations. So if you see, because I use Broward County, I did not enter enough dollars for their jury. So it's telling me, hey, you've got all this money you haven't used. You need to make sure you use it. If I were to go back to the front tab and changed it to a smaller county. Take Lafayette. And then come back to our net tab. Then, you know, it'll give me the same thing, the same warnings, like, okay, here's how much you are allocated in your budget authority for your jury and for your net budget. And here's how much you have entered on the spreadsheet. So it's telling me you need to go enter more dollars. And then the last tab is the G tab, the additional info tab. The first section is doing a comparison to your prior year operational budget and then to what you've entered on this form. And then for the differences for the budget and for the FTE in the second section, 1B, it's asking you to tell us where those differences are and by the clerk court services framework categories. And again, this is just another tool that we use in messaging, and we can say, you know, here's where all the increases came from. You know, we had a lot in case processing or, you know, reports or pro se assistance. That just helps us to divvy out, okay, these are where these extra dollars are going to, or in the case of a year where we have to take budget cuts, these are where those reductions are impacting. This is the direct impact on our duties in order to take this budget cut. And then section 2, you'll notice is missing. We're no longer require that section. So then section 3 is FRS and health insurance. So your gross cost is going to be your total court-related costs. And then your net amount is the amount that's funded from your CCOC budget. So if you are 100% CCOC funded, then it's going to be the same for gross and net. But if you have an agreement with your county and they pay for your FRS increase, then your gross would be the amount that's court related and your net would be the amount that comes from your actual CCOC budget that you've included in the prior tabs. And then same for health insurance. And so we want to see the actual numbers for 1920 and 2021, and then you're projected for the 21-22 budget, which is this form. Okay, and then section 4 is related to retired previous employees. If you have any OPEB, we did have OPEB columns in the personnel tabs. We had it in the operating detail. And so that information gets brought forward to this section. So if you entered anything on the personnel tab or on the operating tab, then you would see something here in column D. And then you would just tell us in G, the part that's not funded from CCOC, so the non-CCOC funding, it'll automatically calculate the CCOC funded. And then there's a room for you to provide explanation for those costs. And then, of course, our last section is the additional info. That's for the information that came from Exhibit E. If you have differences from the section 1B above, or any other information that you need us to know. We have several counties that provide further anecdotal information on whether why this budget is still not enough to meet their needs, or if you have a special scenario, like we said before, you've got your targets are off by 20% and you have a valid reason why, this would be where you provide us that type of explanation and information. Okay, so any questions related to the operational budget or any of the tabs that we've previously discussed? Friday, December 17th. Yeah, so you've got about 4 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. We're not showing it in this form because we have a separate tracking sheet that tracks, these are our revenues and these are our expenditures. And because that is a non-recurring funding source, we're not going to show it in this budget, because if we did, then my future numbers would be off. Correct. Yes, ma'am.
And it seems like they're trying to stop. And it's going to stay at this time of year. I think the concern,
Okay,
especially when
right. So we had, in the 5 budget cycles that I've been here, we had 1 year where we went into January, and then all of the others were in this October to December timeframe. And so I don't know that we're going to move it any earlier, just because of the budget development process and how long it takes for us to get that final budget. The last couple of years, we were up to the wire getting that number in before October 1. And so this year, we were able to work really hard to get that in early. Because for us, once we get that number and I do everything that I need to do, and now it's going to be Griffin, it takes about 2 months for that budget amendment to be processed with the state and for those dollars to actually get to the counties. So they're not getting their October funding until November, and they're getting October and November together. So yes, if the budget committee can get that number done early, then we can move this process earlier. But we did have several counties that said, I don't want it when I'm doing my startup in October. Like, I want it after, let me get through my first year startup in October, and then we can do it. And so for us, we're a small office too. So it depends on being able to get everything rolling. We had staff turnover and just trying to get the new staff onboarded. So I hear you, and that is something that I'm sure Griffin is going to address looking forward, because he likes to calendar things and he likes to have a plan. So that will be something that we can work on, trying to get this in early November so that you've got time to flex it out with your schedule. Thank you. Any other questions? I still have more to cover, but yeah, John. Okay.
I know when you put your actually put in information that, for example, previous years when you had posted for a large county, hundreds and hundreds of staff.
No. And that's a good question, because, okay, so we do not include your previous information because that would be a massive lookup that we just cannot contain that data. If we were to do that for all 67 counties, you wouldn't be able to open this spreadsheet. So you do have to use your information and use whatever is current for your office at the time that you're filling this out. And then if you have information from a prior spreadsheet that you want to copy over because you still have a lot of the same personnel, when you copy, let me get back up here. So if I were to copy this information, I want to paste it as special values. Hopefully you can see that pop up. That's the one that you want to use. You don't want to just use a regular copy paste, and you don't want to drag. If you were to take this cell and drag it down, it's going to break the automatic things, and it's not going to come in. We don't want you to link our form to any of your own spreadsheets. That will break. And we don't want you to use formulas. That will also break coming in. So if you want a clean B tab that's not tied to anything, I can get you one. And then you can do your linking, you can do your formulas, and then at the end, copy from that and paste special values back into this form. And don't get messed up and accidentally send me that one. I had one county accidentally do that, and I was like, nope, not your budget. I need the rest of it. And then also, you can't copy entire rows because there are hidden columns that we no longer use, but because of the way the formulas were done, We're not as crafty at that in order to be able to take those out and make everything work. So to keep everything in line where it still works like we need it to, we just hide them. But you can copy whole columns. So if you copy an entire column, you can pay special values that column back. You cannot copy the gray cells because those are locked. So for columns B and C, you've got to copy from the row below. But if you copy and paste special values whole columns at a time, you can bring in your prior year data. It's a good one. Okay, next question. Last year we had one. Yeah, that's rare. The B tab and the B1 tab, because the majority of your costs are in personnel. And getting that allocation right for the FTEs, those are the two tabs that drive everything going forward through the rest of the spreadsheet. So having your information accurate and then having it allocated the way that you need it to, because your systems aren't set up like our form is. Some counties have started moving towards that, so it's easier for them. But if you have a legacy system, or if you have just, it would be such an exorbitant cost for you to move that way. You're going to have to figure out your own crosswalk. I have one county that said in order to do his EC report every month, he has created canned reports in his system, and he runs 7 reports every month to help him build that report. So he's figured out a way to get the reports out of his system in a way that matches up to our forms and spreadsheets. So those are the two tabs with the most detail, the most information, that I think are the hardest ones, because everything else is built on those. So for us, that's against, it's big for Jason when he's doing his bill analyses, when he's looking and saying, okay, we know that we have court-related costs, and we know that our current funding model is not sufficient to cover those costs statewide. And we can show you statewide where we're getting backfilled and why. Or we can say, we know that there is this grant funding out there, and maybe try and get that information available for all the clerks to see that it's available. There's sometimes just very special and unique situations, but if we don't see that in the budget form, then we don't know that. We can't add that to our repertoire of tools and information that we can use when lobbying on behalf of the clerks. Okay. Any other questions related to the operational budget? Okay, and the easiest part of this whole process is the certification letter. You know, it's not done till the paperwork's done. And you'll notice here that we outline the functions that are allowed to be funded from CCOC funds, case maintenance, records management, et cetera. And then the ones that are unallowable, facilities, construction, maintenance, utilities, security, et cetera. And when you submit this, I have a fun little drop down that you can pick your county name. And then the form is fillable, so you can type in the date if you want. And then the line for the clerk's signature, it needs to be a visible signature. So either a manual signature, or if you use electronic signatures, it needs to be the visible form of that signature. And so when you submit your operational budget, we are looking for that big Excel spreadsheet. We're looking for this certification letter, and we're looking for your revenue projections. And then I failed to bring this up earlier. I'm going to bring up the revenue projection form, because I do want to point out that you're going to fill out obviously your county information name, but your projection as of date, there is a date range that it's looking for. And so as long as it's within the calendar year, so if you did that for your date, then it'll be acceptable. If you're just doing 12, 17, 21, it will automatically change it for you. But if you were to try and do that date, it will give you an error message because that's not in the allowable range. So as long as your date is in the date range of this fiscal year, so October 1, 2021 through the end of the year. That was the one key thing I needed to point out on that form. And then I did want to point out in the budget instructions, somebody was saying to me that they were going to print it and then they saw that it was 70 pages and was like, do I really need to print it? But there are some good information in there. On the 4th page is the table of contents, so you can just jump to the pages that you need. I did want to point out that your timeline is included, so you can see when it's due, when you submit these forms. So you'll go to our CCOC website, you'll download the forms. The forms come in like a generic template name. If you can please, pretty please, be sure to change that template name, include your county name at the beginning, and then use the rest of the format that we have laid out here on page 5. That helps us a lot because we are still manually processing reports until that one magical day when we get that fancy system and everything is in the online and in the web and in the cloud, and we don't have to do Excel spreadsheets as much anymore. Until that magical day happens, we're still manually processing. And this just saves us a lot of time on our end. And especially just having your county name in your file name. That is a massive quick help that helps us get everything in line and make sure that we're looking for all the documentation. But the biggest thing I wanted to point out is our exhibits. And so we include a glossary of terms used. We include the UAS code definitions, and that comes straight from the state. We have our statement regarding the IT funding from our general counsel. But in Exhibit D, we have the clerk court services framework included for you. It's not been updated in the last couple of years. That is one of the tasks that the PI committee is going to be looking at for this calendar year, is getting that brought up to date. So this is a living document because every year that there are legislative changes that impacts this document. So if a task or duty is removed through legislative session, then we would update this document. If a new task or duty is assigned, then we would update this document. And so the full document with the statutory references is on the website, but this one just includes the different service areas, the different activities, and the different tasks. So it breaks it down for you. And again, a great management tool for you to look at your offices and say, okay, these are the duties that we're statutorily required to do. Are we doing them? Are we meeting it? And then if I'm doing something that's not in this document, why? Why am I doing it? What's causing me to have to do it? And it's just a tool that we hope that you use. And then, as I said earlier, the DFS audits. So this upcoming fiscal year, DFS, they had to take budget cuts themselves, and so they are short-staffed. And so instead of doing full audits, because we just finished all 67 counties, so it's a 3 to 5 year cycle of when your turn comes up in the full audit. So we just finished everybody. We were getting ready to start again, and they've decided that for the next couple fiscal years, what we'll do is we'll go back to those audits. They're going to look at those audit findings, and then they're going to say, how did you resolve that audit finding? And they're going to be checking for that. They're still going to look at your revenues and expenditures, but they're not going to go into their full detailed audit that they would normally do. They are still remotely working, and so they're going to be doing many of those as desk audits and just a lot of communication through email and by phone. So if you have any questions as that process comes up, if you go to the DFS website, I've included the link in the instructions. If you go there and see, okay, you're on the schedule for this year, and you want to get prepared ahead of time, please call our offices. We have sat down with several counties in the past and said, okay, here's, what your previous audit finding was, here's what you're working on, and just being able to start addressing those findings. And then if you're curious and you want to see any county's full report, I have those linked in the document, so you can just click those and go right to the website to see how other counties were faring with DFS. Okay, are there any other questions that you have related to the budget process, related to anything we've talked about today, or anything that we haven't talked about today that you wanted to hear about? Okay, well, that's all I have. So we're actually ending a little early. So I think what we'll do is we'll still take the 2-hour lunch break. So it's 11 a.m. right now. So we'll come back here at 1 p.m. Okay, and so that will help us stay on track, but get everything done.